I'm not used to microphones, so if this gets soft or loud, you need to indicate somehow that it's not working for you. What I want to do today is I want to talk to you about particular stories. And I want to try and tie this in to the readings I gave you as best I can. And so we're going to be jumping around quite a bit. And if you don't necessarily follow all the links, that's perfectly okay. We can always talk about it some more another time. But I want you to think about the role of stories and language, conversation in your lives. So in trying to think for this course, I was thinking that we have experiences in order to learn, and we have language in order to teach. And at the same time, the act of teaching is also an experience from which we learn. And the act of learning is also going to be an experience in and of itself. And I have to say that I have learned far more from my students than I have ever been able to teach them. So thank you all in advance. I'm sure I will learn from you too. Thinking back a while, when Rome fell and the lights went out in the west and the libraries all fell down and the forests came into the fields that had been farmed for hundreds of years, much of what we know about the story of Western Britain was captured not on paper anymore. It was captured instead orally in the songs of the minstrels and bards that kept going some sort of continuity between the past that some people remembered and the present that in some cases was very difficult to even contemplate. Most of those stories get lost. Most of what we know about that Celtic tradition is what we've derived from the Mabinogion, which is a collection of stories and songs that did get handed on. And Mabinogion itself is an interesting word. It has several different translations, but my favorite is Songs for Beginners. And so we don't get all the really good stuff, the really hard songs that the really good musicians knew and sung. Instead, what we get is basically a fake book. It's the stuff that everybody carried around with them. So when the local lord or the local baron or the local king said, "Sing me another, sucker," you could always whip out the fake book, the Songs for Beginners, and do something that everyone was familiar with. Rhiannon shows up in many aspects of the Mabinogion. She's quite a character in and of herself. But for purposes of today's talk, what I want to tell you about relates to one very short part of Rhiannon's story, where she is living on the coast of Wales, and Arthur and his knights come to visit. And Rhiannon keeps the birds of memory and forgetfulness. And Arthur and his knights come into her hall and dine, and the birds sing so sweetly that a year passes as a night in the halls of Rhiannon. The readings I've given you for this particular lecture, in some ways, I think, tie together around that question of memory and forgetfulness. And more importantly, all three of them are dealing with issues of time and love. And what I would like to try and do today is to tell you two different stories about the same thing, both of which involve time and love. And this first story is very much for Ken Klein, because he's heard this story several times over. I have tried to duplicate a lecture that I gave in this very room to this very class several times many years ago. I hope all of you have been taking time outside. I can see from the empty seats some of you are taking time outside, and that's a really good thing. Here's one of the favorite characters that you'll meet if you do spend enough time outside. This is the great black-backed gull. And for many of us, we have a hard time imagining the seacoast without what people commonly refer to as seagulls. And it's around seagulls I want to spend some time today. The first short poem I gave you to read was Robert Frost's poem, The Gift Outright. And this is the poem that Frost actually read at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. He'd written a rather silly poem celebrating the actual event, specifically for Kennedy. But he was a very old man. It was a very cold day. The sun was bright in his eyes, and he couldn't read the poem that he'd written. And so instead, in the middle of the ceremony, he breaks down and he recites the gift outright from memory. And to me, it's a very important poem in terms of capturing our images, both of memory and forgetfulness. And so when you look at that poem, you ought to pay attention to the words he uses, because he was a very skilled man with words. To the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. Right there, we have captured before us one very particular image of the Americas. Unstoried, artless, unenhanced. T.S. Eliot, in the companion poem to the piece I gave you, warns us that a people without history is not redeemed from time. And he goes on saying, because history is a series of timeless moments. If you go to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service's webpage regarding the Maine Coastal Islands Wildlife Refuge, this is what you're going to find. And I'm going to work through this for the first half of this lecture. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is charged with looking after both game and non-game species in coastal waters and inland. And right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service has ownership over a large number of islands here along the coast of Maine. And they try and explain what they're doing in their webpage. And so they give you a history of the seabirds on the coast of Maine. Seabirds have always relied on Maine's offshore islands as havens for raising their young. Small, unforested, rocky islands provide a setting free of mammalian predators such as foxes, coyotes, and raccoons. Flying distance from the mainland discourages avian predators such as great horned owls. The cold waters surrounding the islands hold an abundant supply of fish for adults and young alike. Maine is blessed with islands. We have somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 islands here on the coast of Maine, if you define an island as a small body of land entirely surrounded by water. I should add parenthetically that my section of the core, subtitled Another Land Made of Water, has been focusing mostly on salt water rather than the fresh water I think the rest of you are dealing with. So we have between 4,000 and 6,000 islands on this coast. Of those, at least 250 right now support populations of seabirds. We've got about half of all the seabirds that breed east of the Mississippi in Maine waters. Many of these are indeed small rocky islands, largely devoid of vegetation. This is very important for many of the seabirds. They're ground nesters. They don't tend to nest in trees. They don't like tall vegetation. It gets in the way of taking off and landing. Native Americans, continuing the fish and wildlife story, have used the coast's natural resources for more than 4,000 years. The red paint people camped on offshore islands in the summer and fished the deep ocean waters. Although they hunted seabirds and their eggs, they used sustainable methods, limiting harvest to certain islands and hunting any one colony only once every 3 years. The Indians arrive here on the coast of Maine somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. The exact dates are open to question. The exact patterns of movement along the coast are also open to question. Most of what we know about them is either compressed into the last 150 years of their independent existence along the coast, or what we find in the enormous shell mounds, such as those who took ecology natural history probably saw on Gart's Island a few weeks ago. Europeans began settling the islands in the 1600s, farming and raising sheep and hogs. The livestock disturbed nesting seabirds and trampled their habitat. The people hunted the birds and collected their eggs. In the late 1800s, the fashion industry posed an additional threat to the birds' existence. Women's hats were decorated with feathers. Egrets, herons, and terns were especially popular and therefore most harmed by the trend. At the start of the 20th century, most seabirds in the Gulf of Maine were on the brink of extinction. So here we've got a story, and it's got a setting, and it's got characters, and it's got heroes, and it's got villains. We've been told very clearly who lives where and how they live, and who's doing well, and who we might want to think of as doing badly. The Indians come to the coast. They're not Indians in this story, they're Native Americans, and they live sustainably for thousands of years. The Europeans arrive, and within a very short period of time, they drive the birds to the brink of extinction. It's very true indeed that there was a hat trade in the 19th century. So this is a picture of a young lady wearing a tern on her head. In 1870 and again in 1890, the height of fashion was to have a hat that was decorated either with a whole bird or in some cases multiple birds. If you look at the list of birds that were on the edge of extinction here in New England, it would include things like American robins that we regard as very common birds today. Terns, egrets, herons were all used for hats. We also find people wearing gulls when they run out of other species. Concern for the future of all birds led to the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. The act protects migratory birds, their nests, and their eggs. At about the same time, trains and automobiles replaced boats as preferred forms of transportation. People relocated to the mainland, easing pressure on seabird habitat. Common and Arctic tern populations rebounded, reaching a high of almost 16,000 pairs along the Maine coast in 1940. So now in our story, we have a hero. Along comes conservationists, and they passed an act, and it works. And the seabird population rebounds. So there was a golden age in the past where there were lots and lots of birds. The devil enters the garden, bad things happen, the birds are almost extinct. And then good things happen, and the birds rebound. The Maine Islands were heavily settled in the 19th century. Prior to the 19th century, Maine was still very much a borderland country. And whereas the waters were very rich for fishing, because the actual borderline between British North America and the United States wasn't fixed, people seem to have been relatively nervous about moving here. Population builds up through the 19th century. Many of the islands had year-round communities on them. Many of the others had temporary fishing communities on them. Then, at the end of the 19th century, with the development of reliable boat engines, changes in transportation, changes in trade, most of the island communities are abandoned. This is Cree Haven. There was a very active year-round fishing community in Penobscot Bay. Now it's just summer people. And over again, you see the same pattern. Islands that had been lived on for several generations year-round either are abandoned completely or they just turn into summer homes for people. If you look at the pattern of the bird colonies, here are Arctic terns in 1900. So this is at the time that the Fish and Wildlife Service quite rightly says seabirds in the Gulf of Maine had diminished enormously. And we have a scattering of small colonies up and down the coast. The recovery was short-lived, however. During the mid-1900s, the spread of open landfills along the coast and an increase in fishery waste provided easy pickings for herring and great blackback gulls. These birds nest earlier than terns, claiming prime habitat and relegating terns to inferior nest sites. Some gulls also prey on tern eggs and chicks. The artificial food sources led to an explosion in gull populations. By 1977, the tern population in the Gulf of Maine had declined to roughly 5,000 nesting pairs. And again, we see this pattern in the story. We have heroes, we have villains. It's time for the villains. The villains are twofold. The villains are us. We have open landfills, we have fisheries, we leave bycatch. The villains are also the gulls who take advantage of this. And if we look at changes in tern colonies, again, these are Arctic terns, and 1931 in yellow, and you can see they extend the whole way down to Long Island Sound, and by 1990, the population has retreated to the north and the east, and it's back to where it was in 1900 when the Fish and Wildlife Services warned us the populations were on the verge of collapse. Restoration efforts since then, since 1977, have turned the tide. This is part of the talk that I gave over and over again to the Corps for several years, because we here at College of the Atlantic were very much involved in those restoration efforts. And I was co-author of the Tern Recovery Plan for the Fish and Wildlife Service. What were these restoration efforts? That's a thinner and younger and less gray me, and I'm engaged in restoration efforts. One of the things that had been observed between the peak period of tern populations along the coast and the 1990s was that islands that had large colonies of nesting common Arctic and roseate terns were almost exclusively islands that had lighthouse keepers on them. When the lighthouse keepers left, within a few years you would come back and you would find just herring and blackback gulls nesting. The Arctic common and roseate terns had disappeared. So what we did was we got rid of the gulls. And some of it was by shooting, and some of it was by poison. The poison was actually much more effective than the shooting. The poison was much more direct. So what you see there is bread laced with DRC 1331. It's an avicide. It works only on the avian kidney, and more particularly, it works only on seabird kidneys. So things like bald eagles or peregrine falcons or turkeys have very different kidneys than seabirds because they're not constantly having to deal with salt. And seabirds, of course, are very different kidneys for you and me because we are not constantly drinking salt. So this shuts down the kidney, and the bird basically goes into renal failure, falls asleep on its nest, ideally, and never wakes up. And it's very precise because you can put it right into the nest, and only the birds that are nesting there will get the poison. And it's lethal. I don't claim to be the world's best shot. I could probably take out most of you. But a bird is a pretty small target. And if you see a gull down on the intertidal, you don't know for sure whether that's a bird that just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or whether it's a nesting territorial bird that may be actively trying to drive off the birds that you're trying to encourage to nest on a particular island. If you put poison directly into the nest of the nesting bird, you know exactly who you're going to get because only that pair will be there. It's not much fun. One of the things that people would always ask me is, gosh, John, do you really hate gulls? The more I've watched gulls, the more fascinated I've become with them. This is a dead blackback. The blackback gull is the largest gull in the world. It's got a wingspan of over 4 feet. You find them all around the high Arctic. Blackback gulls aren't known to be in the Gulf of Maine as nesters until the 1920s. This is a high Arctic bird. One of the many, many mysteries I and my students grapple with every year is why, in an era of supposed global warming, are we seeing more and more northern species coming south? We see southern species coming north, but we also see the northern species coming south. So I have the blood of several thousand gulls on my hands, and it's not something that I take lightly at all. But it worked. So in each island where we killed the gulls and put out decoys and played sound recordings, we got terns back, and they came and they nested. And this has been celebrated up and down this coast and actually globally as a real success story in terms of conservation, because we've taken areas that had lost species of birds and we've restored them. When I say we, this has been a very collaborative effort. College of the Atlantic played its part in it, but National Audubon Service Society has had a major role. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has played a part. The State of Maine Department of Inland Fish and Wildlife, the Canadian Wildlife Service. It's been a cross-border, cross-agency, cross-group effort to create tern colonies up and down the coast. Besides the Arctic tern in the previous photograph, which is a very common species in the high north that comes south relatively recently, we also had success with this guy. This is a roseate tern. This is a tropical species. And in the tropics, they're very numerous indeed. There are two small populations that come up each side of the Atlantic. One nesting as far north as the Bay of Fundy, one nesting as far north as the Irish Sea. Both of those outlying populations have been on the verge of disappearing for more than 30 years. Something to think about as a human ecologist. If you were to walk on the eggs of a common tern or an Arctic tern, this guy, probably the people responsible for them would be very upset with you. If you were to walk on the eggs of this character, you could conceivably get a $10,000 fine and/or 6 months in jail. Roseate terns are protected by the Endangered Species Act. I strongly encourage all of you to take classes with King Klein so you can get details of the way the legal system works. And then I also encourage you to think about why we make certain exceptions for certain species. It's true to me the roseate tern is the most beautiful of our local terns. But $10,000 fine and/or 6 months in jail? This is the commonest bird in the North Atlantic. Another effect of the removal of gulls from islands up and down the coast during the 1980s and the 1990s was increasing numbers of Atlantic puffins settling on the islands. And this also has important human ecological implications. From occasional visitors, puffins have become more or less guaranteed residents here in Maine in the summer. From something that bird freaks would get excited about and call each other up in the hotline, these guys have turned into a multi-million-dollar industry. Thousands and thousands of people come to Maine every year explicitly to see puffins. Their trip to Maine is a success if they get to watch one of these characters, and it's in part a failure if they don't. Go down to Bar Harbor, go through the tiki-taki tourist shops, and count how many different puffin items you will find. And flip them over and see where these puffin items are made. Virtually none of them are made in Maine. What the person working in the factory in central China thinks they're painting as over and over again they paint that puffin ashtray, I have no idea. Remember, as I say, this is the commonest bird in the North Atlantic. We estimate 13 million puffins between here and the United Kingdom. Maine is on the very edge of their range. We've got a couple of hundred pairs here in Maine. if all the puffins in Maine were to disappear, you would not be able to notice it on a global scale. So that's the story that the Fish and Wildlife has to say. We had a situation where we had a Gulf of Maine with a vast abundance of seabirds. We had Native American peoples living in harmony with them. They harvested them in sustainable ways. Thousands of years go by. Europeans arrive. The whole thing goes to hell. And then courageous conservationists restore some sort of balance, bring the seabirds back. That's the story I told over and over again to this class for the first 10 years I was at the college. I'd like to tell you a somewhat different story now. So this is the same place and the same birds and the same people, but slightly different perhaps. And this is taken from the Eliot poem I had you read. And I really have to stress that these are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses. And the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. But going back to Rhiannon and her birds of memory and forgetfulness for a second, part of what I want us to all think about is what happens when we choose to forget, when we lose our history, and yet we are not redeemed from time. Thank goodness I was really keeping my fingers crossed, but Dave Feldman came through for me, and the time machine was ready just in time for me to slip back 14,000 years ago and take this snap of the pass just outside of Jackson Lab where the tarn is today. Not. So this is a glacier in my native New Zealand, but I want you to think about this as being what the landscape of Maine was like 14,000 years ago. You would have great tongues of ice just like this, sweeping through and over every single mountain on this island. This was the landscape of Maine 14,000 years ago. This was Mount Desert, a couple of thousand years later. So in white, you see the shoreline from about 12,000 years ago. In blue is the modern-day shoreline. Because when the ice melts, the land is compressed enormously beneath the weight of the ice, and the sea runs in over it. It was sea all the way to Bangor. All of those islands, all of those 4,000 to 6,000 islands that I talked about earlier, were deep beneath the water. My section went with me to Gorham Mountain, and we were 250 feet above the present shoreline. And there is the sea cave with the rounded boulder where the surf came in. So rather than being a Mount Desert Island, in those days it was a broken archipelago, a shattered island with deep water over most of the present. And all of the islands that are important to seabirds today were deep underwater. A couple of thousand years later, the land had risen much faster than the sea had, and the shoreline had retreated out almost to Mount Desert Rock. So Great Duck Island, Little Duck Island, Cranberries, all were little hills in a grassy plain. The Gulf of Maine itself, one of the things we know of it today is it's been an incredibly rich and fertile fishing ground. A lot of the reason it's so rich is the enormous tides. So down here at MDI, we've got typically an 8 or 9 foot tide. And as you go east, it gets much more exciting. So you go round Seguda into 10 to 12. You go up Englishman Bay, 14 to 17. You get into the mouth of Fundy, and things start getting really exciting. Up there, 20, 30 feet, 47 feet of tide up here in the basin. You go through Grand Manan Channel as the tide's turning. This is Grand Manan right here, narrow channel cutting through. and you're driving your boat, and you think somebody's pulled a couple of cylinders out of the engine, because suddenly you're up against a 5-knot tide of all that water pouring out of Fundy. That creates an enormous amount of upwelling, enormous amount of mixing. All that mixing, all that upwelling brings all the gunk, all of the dead stuff, all the fecal matter that would otherwise have dropped out of sight down to the bottom of the bay, up to the surface where it can be used by the phytoplankton and form the basis for foraging by fish and in turn by things like birds and whales. This is where the ice extended to at its maximum. And so George's Bank, out here along the Scotian Shelf to the Grand Banks, these are all what used to be the topsoil of New England, pushed out to sea. Where Suzanne and I spent our growing up in California, you go offshore from the Golden Gate, and as soon as you go through the Golden Gate, the bottom drops out of the sea, and you're 20 miles offshore, and the water is thousands of feet deep. Here, you go 80 miles offshore, and it's too shallow for a large ship to pass. Again, you've got these huge banks which create upwellings. That's where the fish are. That is our image of the Gulf of Maine until very recently. 5,000 years ago, it was a very different picture. The reason we have the great tides we have today is the length of the Bay of Fundy happens to match perfectly the tidal cycle. So the tidal wave runs up Fundy and it reinforces itself. It's just like you do not try this in your dorms. But when you get home, lie in the bathtub and think of us and slosh back and forward slowly in rhythm. And what is going to happen? The wave will build and build and build and slop out of the tub, and your parents will be pounding on the ceiling because the ceiling is now dripping. Okay? Same thing happens in Fundy. The wave reinforces itself, and it builds and it builds and it builds. But Fundy has to be exactly the right length. 5,000 years ago, it wasn't that long. 5,000 years ago, we were a very different geographic and geological distribution, and a bunch of this stuff wasn't here. So instead of the wave reinforcing itself, the wave canceled out. And we had no tide here. If there's no tide, there's no mixing. If there's no mixing, all that good organic stuff from the surface goes down to the bottom and settles. And there's nothing for the phytoplankton to feed off, and there's nothing for the zooplankton to feed off, and there's nothing for the fish to feed off, and then there's nothing to feed on the fish. 5,000 years ago is when the Indians first show up here on the coast. Shortly after that, the land subsidence, the sea rising, changes in the topography of the coast start to produce the huge tides that we're now familiar with. And once the tidal cycle gets going, more and more people come to settle along the coast of Maine. So we have all these islands. And when we actually pay attention to the people who come and settle on the coast of Maine and see what they're eating, it's very clear that they're here year-round. This went from being a relatively tideless, relatively warm, relatively sterile body of water to a very rich and very productive place indeed. The Indians were not native to the Americas. They come out of Siberia. They're big game hunters. Their technology, their culture, their civilization is built around the hunting of large mammals, as best we can tell. But remember, these are only hints and guesses, because none of us were there. All the large mammals in North America, for all practical purposes, go extinct. The Indians arrive in an amazingly rich mammalian fauna, which then vanishes. And they're left with buffalo and deer and elk and antelope, a handful of things to live off. So once the great cycles of tide in Fundy build up, the coast becomes a very profitable place to be. And rather than just being here in the summer, they were here year-round. And they fished, and they hunted, and they lived on the islands, and they had dogs. And we know they had dogs because they buried their dogs in the shell mounds. And again, those of you who've been to Ghats and seen that shell mound, one of the most touching things for me about that is we know that this wasn't simply dogs thrown on the garbage heap. A shell mound really is an old garbage heap. But clearly, some of those dogs were very carefully buried. So why, we don't know. But as somebody who loves dogs, I can speculate. One of the things that the Indians ate was this character. This is the great auk. And imagine a guillemot or a razorbill, only one that's this high. The Europeans called them penguins when they first came over because they were familiar with the real penguins in the southern hemisphere. And like the real penguins, this character could only fly in the water. It didn't fly in air. And the great auk seems to have had a range that extended as far south as Florida. We know this from the remains that we find in shell mounds all along the east coast. But there is no evidence that it bred anywhere west of Labrador and Newfoundland. Huge numbers of them as late as the 17th century, breeding on islands off the coast of Newfoundland. And then in the winters, they would come along the coast of New England. This is part of why we know the Indians were here year-round, because the bulk of the great auks would have been here, not in the summers, but in the winters. And that's when the Indians ate them. This character was also here. So this is one of my personal nightmares. This is the sea mink. The sea mink was about a third again as big as a regular mink. So imagine this big with really nasty teeth and a taste for bird brains. And we find evidence of the sea mink on all of the inner islands along the coast. And the Indians seem to have eaten them also, and probably captured them also for pelts. Both the great auk and the sea mink are now extinct. Both of them go extinct in the 19th century. The great auk in the middle of the 19th century, the sea mink at the very end. The very last sea mink we know about was killed on Campobello Island in 1895. The very last great auk seems to have been killed about 1850, probably off the coast of Iceland. And this character was also here. And we see evidence of him in the Indian shell mounds. And we also get accounts of him from the early European voyagers. Bald eagles seem to have been enormously common along the New England coast in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. There are reliable accounts of bald eagles every 2 to 3 miles recorded by a traveler coming up from Boston, going up to Portland. There are accounts of thousands of bald eagles coming into Casco Bay to feed on a big die-off of eels, when, as far as we can tell, a great gas bubble explodes in mid-bay, killing the eels. They all wash up on the beach, and thousands of eagles come in and feed on the dead bodies. And the farmers are shooting the eagles right, left, and center to feed to their hogs. The town of Vinalhaven in 1806 passes a bounty on bald eagles, and you get 12 cents an eagle if you bring the eagle's carcass into the town offices. What's very interesting is if you go to the old accounts of the first Europeans to write about their experiences on the coast, the picture you get is very different from the picture that the Fish and Wildlife Service gives you on their webpage. This is something very important for us to think about in terms of memory and forgetting. One of the difficulties with an oral tradition is stories change and stories are lost. So remember, of the Celtic bards, all we have are the songs for beginners because they weren't written down until very late. And all the really good things really weren't written down because if you were a really, really good minstrel, you didn't want somebody else to steal your song. So we've lost the really good stuff and we're left with just the bits and pieces. Contrary to Robert Frost, history does not begin in 1492. History began thousands and thousands of years earlier for this continent. Yet we don't get it because either it wasn't written down, or even more tragically, people who did write it down were exterminated and their books were burned. So all too often, what we're left with is a very incomplete story where things start with Columbus sailing the ocean blue, move very quickly to people with big belt buckles on their hats, and wind up with the Civil War. And that's the end of history for many of you. If you take the time to actually read the accounts of Champlain when he's sailing the coast for the first time, one of the things that's very striking is he doesn't talk about birds. He talks about everything else, but he doesn't talk about birds here in Maine. When I first read Champlain's account, I thought, oh, he didn't like birds, which was kind of weird, because when you think about Champlain, he's sailing across the Atlantic, and it's not, 6 hours in a jetliner. It's weeks and weeks in a leaky boat. Fresh food's hard to come by. Tasty gull might be pretty welcome, but he doesn't talk about them. So then I read further back in his journal before he gets to Maine. And sure enough, when he gets to Nova Scotia, coming across, he's all about birds. So the islands off the coast of Nova Scotia, that was like a McDonald's lunch counter, because here were thousands of nesting birds with their eggs. But once he rounds Cape Sable, comes south of Fundy, no more birds. Then he gets down to Cape Cod, and suddenly he's all about skimmers and the big birds they're seeing. But between Cape Sable and Cape Cod, nothing. We know that there were gulls in Fundy as early as the beginning of the 19th century. Grand Manan Archipelago seems to have had big colonies of nesting herring gulls. I've yet to find a single account outside the Bay of Fundy of nesting seabirds until we get to the very end of the 19th century. When people leave the islands here in Maine, they don't leave the islands as they found them. They'd clear-cut them, they'd build houses on them, they'd changed the whole vegetation structure through grazing. They'd created an area that was really suitable for a ground-nesting bird. We'd also killed all of the sea mink. We'd also killed virtually all of the bald eagles. And we'd also killed or driven off almost all of the Indians and their dogs. And when you lose those three major sources of predation, guess what? The birds come in. So this is a wonderful man called Dutcher who spent the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century driving a boat up and down the coast of Maine looking for birds. These species, with their exquisite beauty, their wild voices, and their most romantic lives, peopling a realm which without them would be oppressive in its dreary grandeur. He's talking about herring gulls. He's talking about the common seagull that we tend to dismiss, because to him it was new and rare and wonderful. if you look at the maps of what we know about, the very beginning of the 20th century, when Dutch is driving his boat, you've got just a handful of gull colonies right around Mount Desert Island. Great Duck Island, our own island, is the biggest of the whole bunch. And then you have to go quite a ways east to pick up some more. And then here's Grand Manan, and there are lots of gulls around there. There are none west of Penobscot Bay. The green arrows, green stars, are by 1962. So it's very true, as the Fish and Wildlife Service says, that the beginning of the last century, there were very few gulls here in the Gulf of Maine. And by the 1960s, there were very many. What they don't mention is how people dealt with that. Yes, there were open landfills. Yes, there was the bycatch. But there were also people doing other things. So in the 19th century and the early 20th century, there were huge runs of herring all along the coast, and a great weir fishery where people were catching tens of thousands of tons of herring. Some of that was being used for lobster bait. An awful lot of that was being used for agriculture as fertilizer. So the farmers were spreading tons and tons of herring on their fields. The gulls that survived must have regarded this as being, they died and gone to heaven. These wonderful people were putting out all this wonderful dead fish for them to eat. The gulls go in and feed on it. Very quickly, the farmers get peeved, and they say to the federal government, do something about this. And after a while, the federal government does. And the federal government launches a gull control program where they send people up and down the coast into the gull colonies, and they spray all the nests with a mixture of mineral oil and formaldehyde. The mineral oil kills the embryo inside the egg by suffocating it. The formaldehyde preserves the egg so it stays there for weeks. The birds go on sitting on it, and eventually it's too late to re-nest. So here is a character out in our own Great Duck. There's our house in the background. I can't work the lights. There's our house. And he's spraying a nest just down near the present boathouse. And on Great Duck, it works. So Dutcher, among others, counts the island back in 1900. And we've got about a couple of thousand pairs going along, spikes up to 2,500 pairs, drops down again to 1,500 pairs, and this is the year after they do the treatment. And from that point on, the island never fully recovers. This year, we're up to about 1,200 pairs nesting on Great Duck, but we're nowhere near the 2,000 to 2,500 pairs that were present at the beginning of the 20th century. We don't know why. Other islands were also treated, and in some cases, they not only recovered, but they increased in overall numbers. Great Duck has never recovered. Other species of birds have been moving into the Gulf of Maine. So these are black guillemots, another northern species coming south. Maine is as far south as they nest. Double-crested cormorants and great cormorants. Double-crested coming up from the south, greats coming from the north, nesting along the coast. Leach's storm petrel. This is probably the commonest bird in the Gulf of Maine. Remember I said puffins are the commonest birds in the North Atlantic. We have no idea how many Leach's storm petrels there are. We think after years of work there are about 5,000 pairs of them nesting on Great Duck. But we don't even know how many islands have Leach's storm petrels on it, never mind how many Leach's storm petrels there are. And eider ducks. This is the big sea duck that you're going to see in big rafts, I really hope, behind sea fox all winter. This is also the only commercially hunted seabird here in New England these days. And they're ground nesters like the other birds, and they'll lay anywhere from 2 to 10 eggs, and only the female looks after the nest. And so she covers the nest up with a wonderful layer of down so it stays warm and it's camouflaged when she goes to sea to feed. Then there are these guys. So remember I said that they were hammered all through the 19th century? bounties down at Vinyl Haven, being fed to hogs in Casco Bay. By the turn of the 20th century, there were estimated 100 bald eagles left here in Maine. By 1948, it was down to 50 pairs. Stays low, and this period, 67, 68, moving into the 70s, population isn't going anywhere. Even though the Bald Eagle Protection Act had been passed some 40 years earlier, population is being hit by a combination of disturbance, probably also persistent pesticides. And then it starts to take off. And that's as pretty a J curve as you're never going to see in my ecology classes. Not only numbers, but distribution. This is data from 2 years ago. So you're sitting right up here, and each of these red stars is a bald eagle nest. And here's great duck here, little duck, cranberries, Gott's Island right there, black and placentia right here, swans over here. They've all got multiple bald eagles. Up and down the entire coast, we're seeing more and more of this. Bald eagles coming in, sweeping through the colonies, grabbing chicks, smashing eggs. As far as they're concerned, seabird colonies are a giant lunch counter waiting to be used. And that's what you get, which is kind of depressing when you've spent the summer watching this guy and hoping he's going to fly. These characters have also been showing up more and more. So seals, for hundreds and hundreds of years, were hunted along this coast, probably for thousands of years. We also find seal remains in the shell middens from here down through Rhode Island. The very intense hunting happens again in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then as we move into the late 20th century, the whole Save the Seal movement takes off. The seal cull is enormously reduced. Seal populations increase enormously. And yeah, he was so cute, but here's an eider duckling, and that's cute. And guess what? As far as the seal is concerned, that's lunch. As the eider population faces a combination of predation from bald eagles and hunting from humans, it's also facing more and more predation from seals. The thing that I dread is that we've chosen particular views of how the world ought to be, and yet we're very reluctant to actually take the stories that we know about those quite so seriously. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has chosen to forget over 9,000 years of history here in the Gulf of Maine. And they tell a very convincing, very positive story about conservation and success. They identify the villains, they identify the heroes, they come up with a plan, they apply the plan, and there's a solution. And we now have the better part of a dozen very large tern colonies up and down the coast of Maine. Any gull that tries to nest on those islands is shot, or its eggs are smashed, or both. In the meantime, we've gone to great lengths to reintroduce the peregrine falcon, who likes to eat terns, and to encourage the development of a bigger and bigger population of bald eagles. The bald eagles are doing what bald eagles do. They're eating gulls. Why does this matter? Well, one of the reasons it matters is that if you look at the eider ducks here in the Gulf of Maine, the only islands you're going to find eiders nesting on are islands with gulls or with Audubon wardens with rifles. Why? Because we know from studies in Europe that carrion crows are extremely good predators on the eggs and chicks of eider ducks. We don't have carrion crows over here, but we do have crows and ravens. The gulls keep the crows and ravens away from their own nests, and while protecting their own nests, they protect the nests, quite by accident, of the eider ducks. Seems to be even more involved than that. So 2 summers ago, one of my students, Adriana Baudet, did a study on great duck looking at the guillemot nests in relation to the gull colonies. We're finding the same pattern holds true for guillemots. You only get guillemots nesting where you have gulls. When the guillemots try to nest in areas without gulls, the crows go in and eat all their eggs. So the bald eagle, as it increases in numbers, is having a greater and greater effect on the gull colonies. As the gull colonies are abandoned, the eiders are abandoning, and along with the eiders, we're losing the guillemots. So what's the point of all this story? What are we going to do? The Fish and Wildlife Service thought they had a very simple answer. Gulls were the bad guys, humans were the bad guys. We couldn't get rid of the humans and their garbage, so we could get rid of the gulls. The more we look at this, the more we actually pay attention, the more complicated it becomes. The main thing that I wanted you to get from my readings was the seriousness of time and love, and how complicated both are. One of the things that's so important to me about human ecology is recognizing how complex and different stories can be. It's never the same story told twice. You have to keep going back and asking yourself, have I covered all the bases? And then in the end, you have to turn around and look at yourself and say, if I want to act in the world, knowing as I do that the world is a very complicated place, and knowing that I never have the whole story, I have to be very, very careful. Do I regret killing all those gulls? Yes, actually, I do. Would I do it again if I was given the opportunity? No, I would not. I was guilty of not doing my homework. To finish off, I'd just like to bring this back to the overall theme of the course in water. And so this is the ending of Norman Maclean's book, which is called A River Runs Through It. And to me, it ties very much into what I've been trying to tell you today. And at the end of the book, Maclean is talking with his father. And his father says, "You like to tell true stories, don't you?" he asked. And I answered, "Yes, I like to tell stories that are true." Then he asked, "After you have finished your true stories sometime, why don't you make up a story and the people that go with it? Only then will you understand what happened and why. It is those we live with and love and should know who elude us." Then in the Arctic half-light of the canyon, all existence fades to a being with my soul, and memories and the sounds of the big Blackfoot River, and a 4-count rhythm, and the hope that a fish will rise. Eventually, all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over the rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of them are theirs. I am haunted by water. Thank you very much. Goodbye.